In Michigan, but we got Alan Dershowitz with us. Professor Dershowitz, welcome back. What is your reaction to the ruling this evening?
Well, I think this was the Trump administration's strongest case in the Supreme Court, the original jurisdiction. Now that it's been turned down, all they have is Pennsylvania, where the numbers don't seem to support it. So this does seem to be realistically the end of the line. I happen to think the majority of the Supreme Court was wrong. I think there is standing. If there were a case, for example, where a state could show that another state, say if we go back to 2000, that Florida had corrupted the election and had turned the election to one candidate rather than the other, I think another state would have standing. But I think what the Supreme Court is sending a message is they don't want to get involved in this. It's too messy. And when you get the new justices, the ones appointed by President Trump, agreeing with the traditionally liberal justices, I think realistically, if I were a lawyer for the Trump administration and my client asked me for my honest assessment, I would say this signals that the likelihood the Supreme Court will get involved in the case in any substantive way is close to zero.
Well, hold on. All right. Now, listen. I've seen stranger things happen in a courtroom, all right? I've seen O.J. Simpson walk. So, I mean, this is not over. And I want to go back to, you were there. I want to go to Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania, to me, as you mentioned, that's still alive. It was erroneously reported that it was over. The Pennsylvania...
No, they will win Pennsylvania. I think the Trump administration will win the Pennsylvania lawsuit if the court decides to take it. The law is on their side on that issue. The question is, are the numbers on their side?
No.
The Supreme Court is not going to go around reversing an election unless it is clear beyond dispute. I go back to the 1954 desegregation decision. Before the Supreme Court decided to desegregate the South, they needed a 9-0 decision by all the justices. I don't think they would, on a 5-4 or 6-3 decision, reverse a presidential election. I think they would need a consensus, and they don't seem to have that at this point.
The thing is, you know, it's quite frankly not their job to reverse a presidential election. Their job is to evaluate the constitutionality of Act 77 in Pennsylvania, and if it was done in accordance with the state constitution of Pennsylvania. That should be their scope. But you're telling me, practically speaking, they're going to worry about everything else that goes with it.
Well, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said the job of the lawyer is to predict what the courts will do. In fact, I'm making a prediction. I'm not telling you what's right or wrong. I happen to agree with you. I think the court should call it according to the law and let the chips fall where they may, without regard to who wins or loses. But I think the Supreme Court, particularly the Chief Justice, sees himself as somebody who wants to preserve the integrity of the Supreme Court. It was Alexander Hamilton who said the Supreme Court has neither purse nor sword. They have to simply depend on the public acceptance of their decisions. And I think they think the public is not ready for a decision that would reverse this election. And that was joined by the 3 justices appointed by President Trump. So if I were President Trump and if I were his lawyer and if he asked me for my advice, I would have to give him my honest advice. I'm like the doctor reading the CAT scan. I'm not the cheerleader. And the doctor reading the CAT scan says, this seems to signal to me that the Supreme Court has said it's out of this election.
All right. Well, listen, I would have to say, doctor, we're going to go get a second opinion. And I think that is exactly.
You
Thank you.
A second opinion, but you heard mine.
But Professor, I appreciate it. Do me a favor. Don't go far. I do want to bring in Patrick Baysham, founding director of the Democracy Institute, who wrote a piece for The Spectator that for many of us just kind of changed the game. He put it out in such logical form that what Joe Biden did with 80 million votes was essentially impossible. It defied so many historical patterns that it could not, or there was a great chance it wasn't legitimate. Patrick, I hope I summarized that effectively. By the way, I don't think you're a lawyer. You're a pollster by trade. Anyway, welcome back to Newsmax. What do you think of what's going on right now?
Well, I agree with just about everything that Professor Dershowitz has said. I think 2 things are clear. One is, once again, a court, in this case, the most important court in the country, has not ruled on the evidence available. They have made a procedural technical ruling, which may or may not be correct. But that's an important distinction, I think, going forward.
One thing that, well, lots of things trouble me, but the notion that the American public, they're not ready to accept a change in all of this, and implied in that is that there will be violence if the results are changed. Now, if there was cheating, as I believe, that really makes it even more sinister. You know, accept these results or something bad will happen. And some folks are really wondering, the justices, perhaps they are thinking also they don't want protests in front of their house. They don't want their lives to be disrupted. I know this is way outside your field of expertise, but I'm wondering, and if you care to share your thoughts, how much that's at work here.
Well, I think it's clearly at work to some degree. I think we've seen in the respective state legislatures, including those controlled by Republicans, state governments where the governor, the lieutenant governor, et cetera, may be Republican. And again, in some of the courts, we're seeing an unwillingness to get involved, an unwillingness to shake things up, an unwillingness to sort of stand up and say, not only do I think this is wrong, but I'm actually willing to do something about it. I think that is the fundamental problem. So one of the lessons, perversely, we have learned already is that one cannot count on politicians and perhaps even justices to stand on principle if their own personal or professional self-interest, they conclude, rightly or wrongly, is at risk. That's an understandable human decision, but it is not what they are elected or chosen, selected, and paid to do. They're selected, paid, and elected to stand on principle and to do what is best, either by law or in the interests of their constituents. So it's very disappointing that there is so much of that going around, but it is a reality.
I have to go to Professor Dershowitz for one thing. You know, Professor, I'm hearing for days now how irresponsible it is for you to be talking about these lawsuits, and you must accept the results, and that you're undermining democracy. All of what we're doing and all of what we're talking about is well within law, certainly the Constitution, and even negotiating on the floor of the House of Representatives, if it's next week, the Electoral College, however that works, that's within the Constitution as well, isn't it?
Of course, what you're doing is a very important part of democracy. It's part of our system of checks and balances, which includes the media. I've said from day one that in order for this election to be turned around, you'd need a perfect storm. You'd need the judiciary supporting it, and they're not. You'd need state legislatures supporting it, and so far they're not. Maybe we'll hear from some state legislatures. You'd need the numbers supporting it, and you'd need the evidence supporting it. And thus far, I think some of the law supports the Pennsylvania attack. I do think that Texas has standing, but right now it looks like the perfect storm is going the opposite way. And as a lawyer, you have to be realistic in assessing what hints and what suggestions the Supreme Court is sending out. And this decision with 3 justices appointed by President Trump saying that there was no standing, whether right or wrong, tells us the majority of this Supreme Court does not want to become enmeshed in this election. This is different from Bush versus Gore. 1 state, 600 votes. This is multiple states, hundreds of thousands of votes.
I understand.
And it's not the Supreme Court wants to get involved in.